For this guy, I am working on Fawn Stonehenge. This is the paper that's purchased in individual sheets, not the stuff that comes in the pad. The stuff that comes in the pad, it's just a little bit too smooth. Great for graphite, but I really don't like it for colored pencil. So here I'm going with the big sheets that I've cut down to the size that I want. And I'm using only 4 pencils to get my entire background. They are all Polychromos except for the white, Derwent Drawing Chinese White. And don't worry, I am not giving up on my luminance pencils for those of you who just got those for Christmas. I still love them both. For this one, I really just wanted to go with the Polychromos for the most part because I've heard so many people say that they really liked Polychromos with the Stonehenge, and I didn't love it in the past. I mean, I liked it okay when mixed with the luminance, so I wanted to see what I could do with really focusing on the Polychromos. And I actually really did like it with this. I just used a lot of paint thinner. Without the paint thinner, I would not like Polychromos on the Stonehenge. I would prefer the Fabriano Artistico. Now for this one, because I knew I needed a lot of smooth blending in the clouds, I wanted to try this on the Stonehenge, and I went with a fawn so that I could put down the white colored pencil first and have it really show up to be able to see where my light areas were going to be. Plus, I wanted that fawn to peek through just a tiny, tiny bit to give my clouds a little bit more dimension so that I could have the warmth there. So not only am I sticking with four colored pencils for this background, I'm able to get that 5th color, that warmness from the fawn paper. Normally, I don't like to let the paper show through at all, but here with the white, it worked out really well. Now, one thing you'll see as I'm working through this, I am being so messy. Normally, I'm really careful and I work in small circles and I overlap everything and keep everything really smooth. Did not need to do this on this piece for 2 reasons. One, it was going to take so many layers for these clouds, and if I had a heavy line where I didn't blend it really well, where I was being lazy, I could just turn it into a poofy cloud over it with the white later on. So very forgiving for that. The other is that the Stonehenge just blends out so well. It's going to take a lot of layers to get this on here. I'll have the colors I used listed below in the video description. One of the colors, the lighter gray that I used, I really don't think was necessary. I haven't used it here yet. You'll see it more in the center area. And I think that just by layering and using less layers with some white for the center area without that gray, I would have gotten almost the exact same results. So that is a color that if you wanted to drop out, I think you could pretty much get the same thing with the 3 pencils versus adding that one in. Actually, no, I guess I used 5 pencils if you count the Derwent Drawing Chinese White. Counting is apparently not my forte. Now the Derwent Drawing Chinese White, if you were going to pick one of those up, pick up lots. I only got 2 because I wasn't sure if I was going to like it. And it's one that you burn through very, very quickly, but it's amazing. So my next order that I place online, I'm going to be ordering at least 10 of them. Probably more like 20. And I don't think, I know I get a lot of questions on this, I don't think it's a replacement for the luminance. They both do different things. I like the luminance, which is also a very opaque white. I like that white because it covers, it's great for finer detail, whiskers and that sort of thing, whereas the Derwent Drawing Chinese White, I really like for larger areas. Like in this case with the clouds, it was just perfect. That would have taken a lot longer to do with my luminance than it will with the Derwent Drawing. And I've not tried any of the other Derwent Drawing pencils. I know there's a few others, but I've so far just stuck to the white. So again, you can see all of those lines that I've got in here, where like sketchy lines. These are things that you normally always want to avoid in colored pencil. But here, again, knowing the way I was going to layer, and then because they're clouds, it's so forgiving that there was no good reason for me to take the time to do the little circles. I'm using a very light hand here. I don't want to push down too heavy too soon because it will damage my paper and make it will prevent it from taking enough layers later on. That paper that you see me moving under my hand, that is just a sheet of glassine. Now, when I say that I'm being messy, you can see that I'm working in all different directions and I'm overlapping, and you can see some of these sketchy lines, but not too severe. I've seen where people do this and they're almost scribbling on the paper. That's still not what I'm doing. While I am being messier than normal, it's still not just scribbling all over the place. You do want to keep that light hand. You do want to overlap this so that you've got a nice even coverage. Now this is in real time. You can see how I'm actually working. I'm doing those larger ovals. And I'm layering on top of layer, whatever's next to it. When I'm working on an area, I layer over it to get rid of any heavy lines. And back sped up again. I just wanted you guys to see how I was actually moving that pencil. So I'm using that Derwent Drawing Chinese White, and I'm just sketching in, and I really am sketching at this point. I'm not worrying about little circles. I'm just sketching in approximately where I want some of my lightest clouds to go. What's going to happen, I'm going to end up getting the majority of this paper really dark gray, and then I'm going to come on top with the white and blend over it. That white will show up really nicely against the gray. But in order to keep some of the areas truly bright, I've got to get the white in there first, which will keep me from getting the paper too oversaturated with gray. Otherwise, I just end up with a light bluish gray where I've gone on top of the gray colors with the white pencil, if that makes any sense. And my friend recently made a video showing you how to draw with graphite to draw clouds. Now, there are so many different types of clouds, and I will link that video below in the description because he does such a good job of describing the shapes and the way that you want to shade everything. But for this one, I'm not worried about everything being perfect. I do have a reference photo that I'm using that is not royalty free, but I'm not copying it exactly. I'm just getting an idea of how those clouds are formed. So it doesn't matter. Again, I'm not trying to make them perfect because I don't want to, being that it's not a royalty free photo. It's just one of those HD wallpapers that I found online. I just wanted to get an idea of how the clouds move. Now, if you are new to clouds, I do recommend draw them exact. Find a royalty-free photo and draw them exactly, because it takes a little bit of getting used to understand how the clouds are formed. And while, yeah, clouds can pretty much be in any shape, if you do them certain ways, they're going to look really fake. And you can take a piece like this where the owl is going to be super realistic, and if your clouds look really fake, it's going to pull the whole piece down. So make sure that if you are new to clouds, find a reference photo that you're going to copy exactly, and it will take a lot longer than what I'm spending on this. This I can move through very quickly because I've done it so many times in the past. This is really going to be like anything else, animal fur or anything. Once you've done it enough times, I've drawn enough tigers that I'm pretty safe to understand exactly how that fur should move and look without having to copy my reference photo exactly. But early on, I did try to copy it more exact than I do now. Now my work still looks as realistic as it did then. I can just save a lot of time because I'm not worried about every little detail. And it's the same with clouds. You will get faster with them. It's just going to take time. But if you haven't done them and really try to copy them pretty exact, or the type of cloud that you're trying to do, if you haven't copied that exact in the past, it's going to make it really hard for you to get that realistic feel and the realistic shapes. I'm using this lighter gray pencil in between all of the white areas, and I'm layering some of that as overlapping on top of the white. I am not being terribly careful here. Now, the way that I do clouds is very much with colored pencil, very much how I do when I'm painting, where I'm doing it in layers and then layering on top of that layer. It's totally okay if that starts to seem overwhelming. Break it down square inch by square inch and finish each square inch before you move on to the next. You don't have to do it this way. This way, because, and especially here because it is such a large piece, I want to say this is an 11 by 18, but this one, that's a lot of surface area to cover, and it took a really long time. So I went through days of having this absolutely terrible looking ugly stage. I didn't even think I posted many of these on social media sites because it looked so terrible to begin with. But working this way, I prefer it, but I have to also realize that it's going to look terrible for quite a while. Now notice when I'm doing a background, I go right up against the subject. Don't try, some people get so worried about accidentally getting a mark on the owl in this case, that they end up with almost a glow or a ring around it where they didn't get the pigment strong enough all the way up against the owl's back here. Make sure that you're going up against that subject. Now the reference photo from this owl I found from Morgue File, and I will link that to you guys. So if you want to draw him, you can do that. And the video for the owl will be next week. Now see where I'm taking some of this pencil and going right over, completely right over some of the white. This is going to help me build depth in those clouds so it's not just parts flat white, parts flat gray. Now my hand on that pencil, notice how close it is to the tip there. I backed it up, but for a second there, I was way too close to the tip of the pencil. I'm generally going to keep my hand farther back when I'm working in the light layers like this. There's no reason for me to have my hand that close to the tip of that pencil until I start burnishing. Keeping my hand farther back will help me to keep a lighter hand. Now my edges here, I'm keeping very soft. Some of this pencil is overlapping into the white, and some of it really is just barely touching the white. This is a section where I think I could have taken my darker gray and just used that instead of this lighter gray pencil. I don't think using this lighter gray really made much of a difference because I ended up covering so much of this with darker colors later on. But as usual, I started lighter than I thought I needed to go and worked my way up to the dark. But for you guys, I think it will be way easier. Just skip this pencil and do everything with that darker one. Again, you can see I'm being very lazy with how I'm filling this in. You can see lines and pencil strokes all over the place. And I'm switching back to that darker pencil. Now notice when I take two colors, when I want them to blend seamlessly from one to the next, I overlap them. Don't think that your paint thinner is going to smudge them together if you've got a heavy line that you don't want. You need to take those pencils and overlap them into each other. Have them well blended before you blend out with the paint thinner. The paint thinner can only do so much. It's basically just dissolving the pigment and pushing it into the paper so you get that nice, deep, rich, painted look. But if you need something softly blended from one color to another, you've got to do that with your pencils first. I think there's a bit of a misunderstanding there, just because I know we all use the word blending with the paint thinner, and you assume that's going to be like blending with acrylic paint, where you can blend the two colors together on the canvas. It doesn't work unless you're doing it with the pencils. So again, notice I'm being very messy, but it's still fairly smooth. Now, if you're not working on the Fawn Stonehenge, but you're still trying to create clouds like this, and you want some of these warmer colors, just switch to some of your warmer gray pencils. Luminance actually has some really, really nice warm grays. I'm asked a lot, if you were only to buy a few luminance pencils, which would I recommend? Obviously the white, and the violet gray. It took me a minute to remember what it was. The violet gray I use all the time, and any of the grays. I love the grays and cream colors. Tans, all of those colors are my favorites in those. I mean, the whole set of luminance is great, but if you're only going to get a few, their grays are just, you can get tones with them that you just can't find elsewhere. Sorry about the planes in the background. I keep stopping the recording every time one goes overhead, but they're going overhead so often that I'm not getting the voiceover done in a reasonable amount of time. I live near the airport, if you can't tell. So now I'm using black, and I'm really darkening up some of these areas, but even though I know I'm going to want them super dark, I don't want to push too hard too soon, because again, I don't want to flatten out the tooth of that paper. I'm just kind of, at this point, loosely blocking in where my shapes are going to go. And the thing is, with these being clouds, they're so forgiving. If you want to practice getting something that's smooth for a background, clouds are a great way to go, because even if you're copying your reference photo and trying to make it exact and it doesn't come out exact, no one's going to notice the difference as long as you're fairly close. I would recommend, though, start smaller than what I'm using here. This is really a very large area, and so, like I was saying earlier, I'm going to go through so many of those ugly stages that it can be very frustrating. So I would say if you're going to do a clouded background, do something that's maybe an 8x10 or even smaller. Don't go too big for your first time, just so that you can move through those ugly stages a little bit quicker and not get so frustrated. Because trust me, even me, I know what this is going to come out in the end. I know it'll be fine. But when you're going through and you have these long stages where it looks terrible, even I will start to get frustrated with it. Or maybe not frustrated, maybe impatient is a better word. I'm taking that darker gray and coming in through on some of these dark areas. And here I am working off camera because we all know I need to do that at least once on every video. Now the reason that I'm keeping the glassine over the owl at this point is just in case my hand or my jacket or the sweater that I'm wearing, I don't want it to rub the graphite off that I've previously drawn the owl with. I'm not using it on the other sections so much because I'm not actually resting my hand on that paper at this stage. And I don't really care if my jacket touches or smudges those areas. I just don't want to mess up the graphite line drawing. You can see I'm getting a lot of that pencil pigment onto the paper before I even blend the first time with the paint thinner. And I don't want the same amount of lightness or darkness through anything. It's got to be, there has to be this variation in there. This is the big thing when drawing clouds. You don't want it to all look the same. Variation is such a big deal anytime you do anything in nature, whether it be wood grain from a tree or a shelf, which would also be from a tree, or if you're doing trees and bushes, that sort of thing. Don't try to make everything too uniform. That variation is such a big deal. It's the same, I'm even drawing hair or fur, same thing. I'm still working in those little ovals. Now I've switched to this blue color, and notice how I'm holding the pencil sideways. This is not something that you'll see me do often. What I'm doing is just tinting this color. I need this blue tint over the gray and the black here. I don't want just flat black and gray. So by tinting it, you're not going to look at the piece and go, oh wow, that's blue, but it does give it a cooler tint. And I'm just very lightly going over everything. Now this would not work if it was my first layers. It's only going to work because it's on top of a lot of pencil that's already on the paper. That type of holding the brush sideways like that, if the paper didn't have anything under it, you're going to get a very, very grainy, gritty look. But here I'm going on top of other colors just to slightly tint those. So now I'm blending out with the Mona Lisa odorless paint thinner. I'm using a filbert white taklon bristled brush. One of the things that I've found on this piece, I need bigger brushes for blending, and I ended up switching, and you'll see that later on, to a stiffer brush, which is it's a brush that I've damaged with oil paint, so it's the equivalent of a scrubber. And I will give you the link of the scrubber that I ended up using. I'm going to be buying some bigger ones because it worked really well with this paper for getting blending with the clouds. It was like the best brush. I think that's actually going to be our product of the week on my email newsletter this week. It was so nice for blending with paint, or for blending these clouds out. But here I'm using just the brush that I normally use, and oh, did it take a long time. One of the things with the Stonehenge that isn't my favorite with it is that when you use paint thinner, it's a very soft paper and it absorbs that paint thinner like crazy. And you can see I've got a lot of paint thinner on the brush. So that absorbs so much and it takes a very long time to dry. So I would get this blended out and then I'd go play World of Warcraft for a little while. And then when it dried, I would come back. Don't take a hairdryer to it like you would with acrylic paint. I know you guys see me use a hairdryer all the time. Don't use that on this because it's flammable. You don't want to heat this up. The other thing that I've noticed with the Stonehenge, I have areas that I blended out 2 days ago and it still looks like the paper's wet, and I don't know if it's going to stay stained in that area. It's off to the side where it's not even going to show because it'll get trimmed off before I frame it. But the point is, I did notice that with this one. So if you are one who likes to leave the paper showing in the background, leave your backgrounds white or whatever it is, Stonehenge may not be the best choice for you. Here I'm covering all of it, so it doesn't really matter. You'll see that later in the video where that paper just stays wet. I have no idea if that's going to dry because this is the first time I've had that happen. But because I was using the scrubber brush later on, the scrubby brushes, they absorb a lot of paint thinner. So my paper got so saturated, which was faster and it worked really well for clouds. But yeah, definitely left that mark on the paper that is not wanting to dry. With Fabriano Artistico, I usually wait around 20-30 seconds and then I can go right on top. It's dry enough. With this, it really does take a very long time to dry. Now, to be fair, this weekend or this whole week was extremely humid. I had the windows open here most of the week, which was amazing this time of year, but it was really, really hot and very humid in here. So that's part of why it wasn't drying as fast, I'm sure. But even so, it really did take a long time. So I've got to let that dry. Once that dries, I can go on to my next layers. So I'm taking that lighter gray pencil, and again, this is one where I think I could have just stuck with the darker gray. I don't think this lighter gray added anything special to the piece in the end because I ended up putting so much darker gray over it. You really aren't seeing what I'm doing here. I mean, I'm getting pigment on the paper, and that's what's important, so it's helping me get rid of the grainy look, but I think I could have done that just fine and saved myself a couple of steps by using the darker gray. But as always, it's always safer to go with the lighter colors than to go too dark too early on, so there's that. And I'm still not pushing very hard. I know it looks like I am because my middle finger bends backwards so much. I'm double jointed there, and so it bends the wrong direction. It's not because I'm pushing hard, though. And this is the same thing as before. I'm being pretty messy. I'm going in all directions here because I want to make sure I've got pigment in every little grain of that paper. Now you can see the stain on the feathers on the top of the owl's ear. I want to call them ears. I know those aren't ears. But you can see the paper where it's discolored there where the paint thinner got onto it. It's not damaging the paper, but it is staining it. And that area did dry, I believe. Let me actually look at that. That one dried most of the way. There's a little bit of a stain. I hope you heard me as I walked away from the microphone like a genius. But that does have a little bit of a stain still. Part of that can be from last night's work, but it's definitely taking a very long time to dry. So again, if you're going to leave your background the solid color of the paper, be careful with how much paint thinner you're using. And by that, I just mean use less on your brush. It's not that you can't use it. This is the first time that I slopped it on as heavily as I did, and I definitely am seeing where that just is not drying on the edges of the paper. You can see I'm taking that pencil right over a lot of the white clouds. I'm creating shape and form in those. It's very important that I've got lots of various shades of the light and the darks in those lighter clouds. And I'm still using a very light hand. Not until the very end will I start adding actual pressure, like a lot of pressure to the pencil. I do like with the Stonehenge, it does take a lot of layers, which is very nice. Very much like the Fabriano Artistico, in that you can just keep layering. It's a really nice paper. It is much less expensive. I want to say it's about half the price of the Fabriano Artistico. So this is the paper that I definitely go to anytime now where I'm going to do portraits, where I need that smooth blending for the skin. And then here, where I wanted a really smooth background with these clouds. This is a really great paper to work on, and you can use it for anything. The only thing that I don't love it for is fine detail, like teeny, teeny, tiny detail. If I need to leave the background white, the first time that I used it, it's actually a piece that I still love, but I did the damask print where I left the paper white, and I had slightly fuzzy edges. That took a bit of work for me to clean up, more so than on the Fabriano Artistico. That's super easy to do. My work always stays very clean. With this, part of, I think, what makes it blend so great is also what made it smudge really badly. So it was really hard for me to keep some of those details clean where I wanted the white paper to show through. So here, I'm not leaving any paper intentionally or big chunks of it showing through like that, so it doesn't really matter. So it really is a good choice for this project. And the owl will have detail, but it'll be fairly soft detail. I don't want the feathers to look too harsh or come out looking like plastic, so being that this paper will give me it works well for that soft look. I'm taking that lighter pencil and really going over everything here. Again, just getting a lot of pigment on that pencil, that paper. And my hand should be farther back. I'm not sure why I'm holding it so close. When you hold your hand that close to the tip of the pencil, you're more likely to add too much pressure. So you have to be more careful there. If I held my hand back a bit further, it'd be easier to make sure that I wasn't pushing too hard. Now, I work on this often enough, it's really not a problem for me, but it's also a bad habit. So I would recommend back your hand up a bit more when you're doing these initial soft layers. So now I'm switching back to the darker pencil and adding these darker colors in here, or darker values, I should say. Yay, working off the camera again. Well, isn't this impressive? There we go. So now I'm using the black pencil, and I am really getting this area a lot darker. I suspect that I blended that previous layer out. I can't even tell by looking at this honestly. I may have blended that out one more time with paint thinner and then came back. This is the next day. Sometimes I forget to turn the camera on, but if I did blend it out, you guys saw how I've been doing that. Now, you will often hear people tell you how horrible it is to use black. Don't use a black pencil. It's a dead color and it makes your work look unrealistic. You know what? I love black. I think it makes the work look great. That is going to be a personal choice for you. Don't feel like because some artists don't like using it that you can't use it. I love the results I get from black. The thing is, I rarely use black all by itself. I'm layering other colors over it. So in many of these areas, I've either got the gray or I've got the blue color on top of it. And adding the blue on top of it just makes it look that much darker. It gives it that much more depth. So using a black pencil is not this horrible, horrible thing. If you like to use it, go for it. If you don't like to use it, that's fine too. So again, I want to get a lot of variation in here. I don't want it to just be flat gray in any area. And at this stage, this is still what I would call blocking in the color, just getting a general idea of where my lights and my darks go. But if I put something dark in the wrong spot, because of that, the white that I'm going to be using, that Derwent Drawing Chinese white, it's so opaque, I can easily lighten anything up. This really is very forgiving, both the pencils that I'm using and the subject here. That'll all change once I get to the great horned owl, but for these clouds, don't overthink them. Don't feel like every little thing has to be exact. If you're new to it, I do recommend, like I said, copy your picture as exact as you can, but if it's not perfect, it doesn't matter. I mean, you see here, normally I get everything drawn out really well with a graphite pencil before I start working. And in this case with the clouds, I don't even bother with that. I just go start working. Because if something's not drawn exactly right, it really doesn't matter. As long as I can get the general feel, the general shape of those clouds. Now the position of the white markings on the clouds, where they're at, what this is supposed to do is it's going to connect the white on the owl's neck, is kind of continuing on through those clouds, just guide the viewer's eyes. Wow, talking is hard. To guide the viewer's eyes out from that area and then back over to the owl's face. It kind of circles around. Which I know once all of this is done and once I get the owl in, I will have to come back through and adjust some of my lights and my darks just to make sure that that is the movement that's happening, but until I get the owl done. Makes it kind of hard to make sure I've got it exact. Again, you can see I have so many layers at this stage and it still has that very grainy, gritty look. And the reason that I'm bringing this up is that that's normal. And I know a lot of people get really worried about that and feel that it doesn't look very good. I'm using the Mona Lisa odorless paint thinner like you and it's not blending the same. It's because it's not finished. I mean, this has so long to go. It takes a lot of pigment on that paper before it starts to look very smooth and very much like a painting. Until then, it just looks like a crayon drawing. So here you can see I'm taking that blue and going right over a lot of the grays in the bottom here. And at this point, I could save time and hold the pencil sideways, but it would require me to sharpen the pencil, and I like to try to get as much use as I can out of the pencil before needing to sharpen. But I am not pushing very hard here. Now, I often use the terms push harder, don't push hard, that sort of thing. It's going to be a bit subjective. I know I've seen people work where they were working with too much of a light hand because I'm always saying to draw very light. Play around with it. If you're not getting enough pigment on that paper, try pushing a little bit harder. Maybe your light hand is lighter than what I consider a light hand to be. So don't be afraid to experiment and see what works better for you. I had a friend who worked at a pizza place and they were always complaining because people would say they wanted extra sauce, but one person's idea of extra sauce was not the next person's, and so there were always a lot of problems because of that. And that's essentially the same here. So if you're doing this and you feel like you're just not getting enough pigment, you probably do need to push a little bit harder. See, I'm pulling that blue all over the place. It goes right over anywhere where I've added black. So it's going to blend right into that. One thing you'll notice too, as I move on, a lot of these shapes that I'm forming are going to completely change. Again, going back to it is super forgiving. So if you've got a shape of a cloud that you don't like, with colored pencil, normally it's one of those things where what you've drawn, that's what you're going to get. Like you're not really going to adjust much and have it look very good. With clouds, they are an exception to that because you can keep forming and keep layering and they just look better and better the more you layer. But you can change their form in doing that quite a bit. Blending again with the Mona Lisa odorless paint thinner. Gamsol works exactly the same. Any odorless mineral spirit should work the same. I have people ask me all the time, can't I just use baby oil? You can if you want to mess up your paper, go for it. It really makes the paper not, it messes it up. You can't layer right away, it doesn't dry right. There's a lot of reasons. Baby oil is just not an ideal choice. I've seen where people will use cooking oil and that sort of thing, and oil gets nasty. It doesn't work well with paper. Oil and paper are not a good combination. Which is funny because I'm using oil-based colored pencils, but there's not that much oil in them. Again, I'm using a pretty good amount of paint thinner on this brush. If you were trying to keep the paint thinner from staining your paper like I was talking about having happen, you can use a lot less and still get the same results. It just takes a little longer. And to use less, I just dab more of the paint thinner off onto a separate paper towel. Use a Viva paper towel. Anytime you're using paint thinner like this, the Viva paper towel or anything with oil, Viva paper towels, they're very cloth-like, so they absorb it very different. If you use Bounty or any other brand of paper towel, when that paint thinner touches it, it just kind of spreads and takes over the whole thing. It doesn't do what the Viva paper towel will. So while I don't really use Viva paper towels around the rest of my house, I always have a roll here just for art. And they last forever. I mean, a single roll will last me like 6 months, and you guys know how often I paint and draw. That is $1 well spent. Actually, they may cost more than that now. I have no idea. Now, one of the things that you're seeing happen, notice how much more brown gets pulled in as I'm adding paint thinner at this point. Because of the paper behind it, it's getting darkened up. That's all that is. When it dries, it's not going to have that much of a brown tint to it. Okay, so here's where I switched to a scrubby brush. And you can see this covers so much better. It goes so much faster, and it got really great results. This is a very inexpensive one of those brushes that comes in the set. You get for like $10, you get about 12 brushes. Some different art stores will sell it, including a canvas brush holder. I use them mostly for oil paint, and I had this one was for oil paint. It's very stiff because I've damaged it from not cleaning it well over the years, and it worked great. So a regular scrubber brush would do the same thing. Now the downside to this is that these brushes absorb so much paint thinner. I used an insane amount of paint thinner, like crazy amount, where normally a very little amount of paint thinner will go a very long way. So if you're concerned about how much paint thinner is in the air and how much you're using, that would not be the brush for you to use, because like I said, tons of paint thinner did it soak up, and that meant the paper got just soaking wet from that paint thinner. It made it move very, very fast. It got that section done very quickly. But yeah, that definitely uses a lot of paint thinner. Now the actual scrubber brushes, I used a smaller one of those, and that didn't absorb as much. Those bristles are more tight, they're packed in very tightly, and so it didn't absorb quite as much as that brush that I just used. So I will be switching to a real scrubbers when I get that order placed. And the one that I'm using, it's just a Creative Mark. It's the one that you'll see later in the video. It's got a red handle. It's a very small one. But I would recommend, if you're going to use that brush, get some larger ones as well. So all of that has dried, and now I'm coming on top with the darker colors again. Just continuously building up, and you can see the background here. It's starting to get much smoother. I'm really starting to lose a lot of that grainy look. Now some artists do prefer the grainy, gritty look with colored pencil. That's okay. Just because I'm always talking about getting rid of it, it doesn't mean that it's wrong. It just means that's my preference. I want my colored pencil pieces to look more like a painting or a photo. I don't want that crayon look. And that, again, just personal preference. I have some of my work in an animal hospital in Frisco, and they requested the work that had the grainy, gritty feel because they wanted it to look like artwork. They felt that the ones some of mine were too realistic, and they felt that people were just going to think it was a photo. So it just depends on what the personal preference. There's the word I'm looking for. For here, I'm using the black again, off camera, because I'm really good at that. I'm still using a very light hand. And at this point, I'm not trying so much to get that solid coverage. I'm just darkening areas up. The paint thinner is going to smudge this around, and it's almost like doing a glaze where I'm tinting that color. I'm not pushing hard. I'm not trying to get like the solid look that I was doing on my earlier layers. These last layers here, well, these aren't the last ones, but as you keep going, it goes much faster. You can be a bit lazier with how you're applying the pencil there. Now, when you're doing a background like this, give yourself time. When I initially did this, I started this on the week of Christmas, and my first plan was to get the background and the owl done all for 1 week's project. And I realized it's like, there's no way that there's so much surface area here because I am working larger than normal anyway. But I would have ended up really, really rushing this background, and it would have looked terrible because of it. Your background is really going to take as much time as anything else. With colored pencil, it's just a matter of how long it takes to layer the pencil or the pigment onto the paper. I mean, with painting, I can have that background done in 20 minutes and then the owl spend the next several days on. With colored pencil, that background takes just as long as the owl. Either way, you're using a small tip for the pencil. So definitely allow yourself more time than you might think you need for any background so that you're not rushing it. You don't want a crappy background up against a great owl that would pull it all. It'll pull the entire piece down. Now, if you've got an airbrush, I would definitely airbrush this background. Honestly, I would have liked the results better, and I knew that going into it. I just wanted to make a full colored pencil cloud tutorial. But if you've got that airbrush, that will save you so much time on this background. You can have the whole thing looking almost exactly the same in 20 minutes to an hour, depending on how fast you work, versus the 5 days I spent on this. Maybe not that long. I think I put about 4 days. No, maybe it was 5. I don't know. I lost track with the holidays. It screwed up my schedule. But it was a lot of work to get that much coverage on the paper. Now, you guys will notice I work upright on an easel. This saves my back. I would like to work flat. I actually am more comfortable working flat. I always have been, but because my back does not allow for that, I've had to get used to working upright. And so if you end up having problems where you're getting stiff or sore working flat on a table, get the tabletop easels. They have them at Hobby Lobby for, I don't want to say they're around $30, and then you can use your 40% coupon. But I just stick a board on top of that and work that way, and they set upright, so they're much easier on your back and neck than looking down, for those of you who have back problems. With colored pencil, you end up sitting still for so long, it's definitely one where it can aggravate any arthritis or anything like that. So by adjusting how you're sitting, it'll allow you to work a whole lot longer without the pain. And it took a little bit, I'd say a day or two, for me to get used to working upright like this, but it really was a lot faster than I expected. It's going to taking that blue and going back over a lot of these gray areas. And it's not that I want you to look at this and go, oh yeah, those are blue and there's blue in that sky. I'm just cooling off the color so that I have that contrast between the blue here, these cool grays, and then the warmer grays in the center with where the white is. And a lot of the reason that white has those warm grays or the warm tones is just that the background paper showing through. You can see how solid that coverage is now. But also notice it's not just flat black or flat gray in that background. I've got lighter and darker areas, which help to create the shape of the clouds. Now at this point, I've decided I'm working these two areas a bit separately or different. I'm going to do the one side, leave it how it is, and then continue on the side that's closest to the owl so that you can really see the difference between what happens when you continue layering. One thing, like I said earlier, I hear people say all the time, they'll get about a quarter of the way through and say, it's not blending like yours. It doesn't look the same. It's a matter of layers that you're not finishing it. It just needs a whole lot more, and that's really going to be demonstrated here. Even though the section that I'm working on here won't be finished until later on, you're going to see a big difference between the two. I'm going to have it mostly done. Using that black and pulling in darker areas, and you'll notice as I'm working here, I am not keeping my pencils quite as sharp as I normally do. Again, it's more tinting the color. I'm letting that color just set on top of what I already have in there. If you want to make sure that that pigment is getting into every little nook and cranny of that paper, you'll want a much sharper pencil. When it's dull like this, you're just hitting the tops, and so it's not getting in all those little crevices. Of course, with the paint thinner, that will push it into the crevices, so it's not as big of a deal. But even so, even with the paint thinner, especially on the earlier layers, let your pencil make sure that it's a bit sharper. And of course, when you get into detail work, then you really need it a lot sharper. Now, if you're a Prismacolor fan, then the Prismacolor blocks, what do they call those? Something sticks, art sticks or something like that. Those would actually be a decent way to get a large surface like this covered for clouds very quickly. And they look like pastel sticks. If you're blending with paint thinner, your first few layers will absolutely look like crayon. But if you're blending with the paint thinner and you're adding multiple layers with that, it would be a very fast way to get a very similar look. I wish more colored pencil companies made the art sticks or the colored pencil sticks like that. Again, notice I'm not just taking that black and going solid everywhere. I'm being very selective about where I'm applying that. If you go too crazy with any one color, it will look very flat. You can see I'm taking some of that dark color again and going over portions of the white clouds. Now, another way, if you wanted a similar background with the stormy clouds, this piece would actually look great if the background was done completely in graphite and then the subject in colored pencil. And now that I say that, I'm kind of wishing I had done that, because the contrast between black and white with graphite and colored pencil like that looks amazing. Now, if you are going to do mixed media and you're mixing graphite and colored pencil, do those in separate areas. Don't try to layer colored pencil on top of the graphite or the graphite on top of the colored pencil. They don't stick well to each other. But in something like this, where you could do an entire background just graphite, where no colored pencil was going to touch, it would look amazing. And it would be another way to have the clouds done very quickly. Now here, I'm not trying to get too much harsh detail on my clouds. If I were doing a landscape where the clouds were more of the focus, then yes, I would be putting those harsher lines in there. But here, the owl is supposed to be the focus. And so I've got to make sure that I end up softening these clouds out quite a bit. And I suspect once I get the owl in, I'm going to go back through and soften up even more from what I have right now as I had finished. Now around the edges of the clouds where I want them to look puffy, I'm just doing little circles. And some of those circles pulling in a little further than others. The key there is variation. Don't make all of those little circles the same. So I'm taking that blue and mixing that in again on top of a lot of these black areas. Now, one thing that's pretty nice with colored pencil, you can see I'm getting a pretty straight line of where I'm working now and the side that's under the paper. That will all get worked through and you won't even notice that in the end. Just the way that it blends and mixes together, it's really easy to work in these little squares or little sections and have one completely blend seamlessly into the other. It's a lot harder to do with paint. This is the third day that I was working on this piece. That is a lot of pencil on that paper. I cannot stress that enough. Now with these brushes, when you're using the paint thinner, it's really easy to have harsh lines come up when you've got this much pigment on the paper. And as I continuously add more pigment, it's something that I've got to watch for. So what I'll end up doing is working that pencil or the brush the paintbrush with the paint thinner. I'll start working it in circles in the shape of the cloud, so that if I have a heavy line, it just looks like one of the clouds. But I'll start doing that in smaller circles so that it follows the cloud shape. Another thing people will often ask is knowing, or how do you know when it's finished? How do you know when you have enough layers and you can just stop? And for me, as long as that paper will continuously take layers, if I'm not 100% happy and actually excited about what it looks like, then I'm not finished. I'm going to keep working on it until I look at that and go, wow, I'm excited to have that in my portfolio. And like I said, if you're working in these with light layers, you're not really limited. So you can just keep doing that until you're totally happy with it. Like when I look at that background, there's still a lot of areas where I can see pencil strokes that I need to get rid of. Well, I've got to pull more white clouds through there anyway, so they're going to be hidden. But until I look at that and am fully, truly excited, definitely not done. Like I said earlier, I won't be done with the clouds completely until I get the owl in there, so I know where I might need darker or lighter areas. They're done enough to look like clouds. I mean, they technically could be finished. The adjustments that I'm going to make later on will just be in making it work with the owl itself. So you can see how I'm holding the pencil sideways again. I'm just tinting that color. Not pushing very hard. Almost how I would use charcoals. And then when I come on top with the paint thinner, that's going to blend that all together. Here I'm using that stiffer scrubby brush that absorbs so much paint thinner, which basically means I'm really oversaturating that paper with paint thinner, but it works so quickly, and it really worked nice with the clouds. I was so happy with the results. So you can see there, look at how nice and solid that background is. I can come back through later and add any details I want with the clouds, but on that left-hand side, that is solid, solid coverage. That's what I'm looking for with colored pencil. Until I get that kind of solid coverage, whatever area I'm working on is not finished. See, I'm darkening up these clouds by taking that black and going right over the white areas so that when I come on top later with the white again, it'll make the highlights pop out more. Right now, all of those clouds are just way too white. Going on top with the blue. Blending that out again with paint thinner. Now that that's dry, I'm taking the Derwent Drawing Chinese White and pulling some more clouds in, and you can see that really shows up very well. With this, I am pushing a little bit harder for the most part for most of these clouds. But this is a really, really soft pencil, so I found even the areas that I pushed pretty hard, I was still able to layer even more on top of it. Creating more of that texture in there with those clouds so that it's not too solid. Blending that out. Now you can see as I've blended that out with the bigger brush there, or any stiffer brushes, that is going to, I'm not going to have as much of the white show through. It kind of spreads it out more with that pencil. If I use this softer brush that I'm using now and use less paint thinner on the brush, I can actually keep a lot of that white in there while still softening it out. It just depends on which effect you're going for. And this is something that you should really experiment with because you can get such different results by adjusting just one little thing, like what type of brush you're using or how much paint thinner is on that brush. So look at how well that shows up against the dark. Now the white luminance will show up this well too. The only difference is that one's a harder pencil, and so I'm going to get smaller detail with it, and here I wanted to keep it very soft. I don't want the clouds too detailed, being that they're in the background of this piece, so that's why I went with the Derwent Drawing Chinese White. You can see it's very, very soft. I can get very quickly a whole lot of coverage and keep my edges from being too stiff. Now with this pencil, I'm mostly working in little circles, so I get that kind of poofy cloud look. Some areas I want darker, so I'm going to put, or brighter I should say, so I push a little bit harder. The areas I want lighter, I just use less pressure on the brush. Lighter, I don't mean lighter, I mean less bright. You can see this layering process though, I'm able to really start creating that look of clouds and get depth in there. Now the tops of my clouds I generally keep more bumpy. Another technical term for you guys there. But notice how they're lumpy and the bottoms end up being a little bit more smooth. I also want the top sections to be where my highlights are more focused. So here I'm adding a lot more pressure where I want to get these areas lighter. I'm using the taklon bristled brush here so that I get the softer clouds. I don't want to blend away too much of that white. Not yet anyway. Now notice how so many of these clouds start having that bluish, the cooler gray look, and that's happening because of the blue that I layered in there. Even when using a cool gray, it wouldn't have come out quite that blue. That's why I had to layer that separate blue in there to get that tone. Now I've got to make sure I remember whatever colors I use in the background have to be pulled into the subject as well so that they look like they go together. So make sure if you're doing something like this very separate that you're writing down the colors that you used so that you can pull those same blues and grays into the owl in this case. I don't have a lot of paint thinner on the brush at this point. These are the later layers, and usually as I go on, I use less and less paint thinner where I'm trying to get the soft blending. Now look at the difference between those two sides. That is huge. Again, where a lot of people will call that the side on the right, they get that far, think it's done, and then are confused as to why their paint thinner didn't blend it out as well or why it doesn't look the same. It's just a matter of layering. It's not that there's anything wrong with it. You've not done anything wrong at all. It's just not finished yet. You just want to put a whole lot more time into that. Now back to real time again. You can see I'm doing these ovals and just layering that in there. Going right over quite a few of the different white areas of the clouds. Now in order to get rid of this seam, what you're going to see me do is take that dark color and layer back and forth in between those two areas. One thing that's pretty nice too, if you forget what order you layered something, in this case the colors are not that extreme, it doesn't make that big of a difference. No one's going to notice the difference in the end. Here, I couldn't remember, did I put gray down first? Did I put black once I got to this side? But in the end, I'm just going to keep layering until they all mix together, so it doesn't matter. Now, if you're doing a portrait, then that may make a bit of a difference because you're working with lighter, well, it depends on the skin tone of the person. But if you're doing someone with lighter skin, then it would matter. You might want to take notes on the order that you laid those colors down. But for the most part, I mean, you can just layer until it looks right again. So often, it's just more to do with your values than the colors itself. When I say values, what I'm talking about there is how light or dark something is. See, I'm holding the pencil sideways here. I'm able to cover more surface a lot faster, but I'm not pushing very hard. I'm just tinting that color so that when I blend out with the paint thinner, it gives me that blue hue. I'm doing the same thing with the black pencil, just darkening things up with it using the side there so I get quicker coverage. Now, one thing you do want to watch when you're doing clouds, look for shapes that you may not be noticing because you're working on it. Take a photo with your phone and look at it and make sure there's no weird faces or weird, I can actually kind of see a monkey's face in the area I'm working in. Make sure that you don't have anything weird shaped in there. Everyone's always going to notice different shapes in the clouds. Just make sure there's nothing terribly obvious. Using that bigger brush to blend that out with the paint thinner. Now this isn't going to dry quite that dark. It'll lighten up a bit once the paint thinner dries. You did let that dry, and now I'm going, or start to dry, now I'm going to continuously build up some of these darker values. Now notice again, as I'm darkening up some of these areas here, I'm not darkening up the whole area. I'm leaving some of those light splotches through. And I don't just mean the white clouds, I mean some of the lighter grays. I don't want to cover all of those up or I flatten it out. You can see I'm holding that pencil to the side again just to get more surface area, but I'm just darkening the area, not trying to get full coverage. So that's why the side works there nicely. Now as I come through with the white, again I need to get rid of that seam from where I had done half and half on this. So I'm pulling the white in through on both sides. Now the great thing is here, notice how this white catches on top of that cream colored I have underneath. That cream color was the white, it's just the white with some of that background, the fawn paper showing through. But with this hitting the tops, it just pops out so much. And then you can see where I've mixed in with the black and the blue that I previously had done. I have this now very bluish gray color. I'm focusing my brightest portions on the tops of these clouds and letting them fade to darker as they fade down. I'm using a very light hand on this section. I want to lighten it without it being super bright like the upper section. This area I'm adding a bit more pressure because I do want this portion to be lighter. Blending that out again with paint thinner. I don't have nearly as much paint thinner on my brush at this point as I did earlier on. Now at this point, technically, I could call these clouds finished. This is a decent place to stop. It now just matters how far you want to take it. Once you get everything smooth, you've just got to decide what you want your clouds to look like. But here, everything's smooth enough. I do have enough variation from my lights to my darks here so that the clouds aren't totally flat anymore. You'll see that I keep pulling a lot of these darker colors up over the lighter clouds just to create that much more depth. Now I'm softening things up here with that white Derwent Drying Chinese White again, blending that out with the paint thinner. Now that white pencil, if you're doing it sort of as a glaze, you will get a chalky look. So that's something to be aware of. You're going to notice in front of the owl's face, as that dries, it does start to look chalky, which is great if that's the look you're going for, depending on what area of the clouds that you're doing. But it really does work very, very much like a glaze. So again, you can see I'm taking this darker gray and going right over a lot of these white areas. Again, you do want to be aware when this paper is wet, the pencil looks, from the paint thinner, the pencil looks way darker than it is when it dries. And I don't find that really with the white paper, just this fawn paper, because it turns into such a darker brown. I'm pulling the black color here, darkening up the bottom section of these clouds. So you want to keep in mind where your light source is. Here, it's sort of in that middle area. And so the upper section of these clouds is really where that light is hitting. Now, one thing that you do want to watch when you're painting clouds, don't make a bunch of worms. This is something that I see happen a lot, where there's a lot of these like long lines, which is sort of what I have right here on this bottom section, these long straight lines, or even the clouds up above. You see I've got a lot of these thin lines. These need to create thicker portions. I've got to start connecting all of these and make them look a lot thicker so they're not these long skinny lines. It looks weird when you've got a lot of worms in your sky. Seriously, I give the best art advice. Don't put worms in your sky. You can see how I'm darkening over that. I'm making it more of a chunk of cloud versus long skinny worms. And that's the great thing here. You can just keep working back and forth until you get it shaped how you want. This is so unlike most things that you're going to do in colored pencil. You can see how I'm taking smaller sections here. And again, breaking up these little areas of the clouds. Part of doing these smaller dark sections like I'm doing, this is helping to break up the worms. So when you're doing a cloud, you don't want to take your highlight, do your shadow all along the bottom and your highlight all along the top. That's how you get that worm look. Thicken them up. You want it to fade from your light to your dark areas and have more variation with where those shadows fall. This is where really studying a reference photo of clouds when you're getting started will help. I believe this is the 4th day I'm working on this. Again, this is not a fast process. So if you're going to do clouds like this and you're working this big, plan on it taking a very long time. So I let that dry, took another World of Warcraft break. One of the things that you may want to do to make sure that you're not rushing and working, if you're working on the Stonehenge and it stays wet as long as this does for you, don't sit there watching it dry, because it really was taking a long time. I mean, I'd have a good 15 minutes before it was ready for me to go on to my next layer on some of these, because I did have it so saturated. Now, normally when I work, when I use the filbert, I don't get the paper that saturated where I have to wait that long. But using that scrubby brush that I was using earlier, that big one, that was just getting the paper so soaking wet, it really did take a very long time. So I found that I had to step away from the easel, otherwise I was too tempted to start working over it. And if you work over an area that's too wet, if it's a little bit wet on this, I found I was okay. But if it was like really wet, I had just done it. First, the pencil doesn't stick to it that great, but the bigger deal is that you damage the tooth of the paper. It's softened and it's easy to damage at that point. So for me, I went and played my video game for a little bit and then came back. And I mean, if you've got a book to read or something like that where you can keep yourself occupied, that will help you not to rush it and start working over an area that needs longer to dry. At this point, I want just enough paint thinner on that brush to start blending it out. It does not need to be soaking wet. And I keep darkening up my background. I do want it really dark so that that owl really pops out. The owl has a lot of dark colors in there, and a lot of the dark in the feathers are going to mirror or kind of copy the shape of a lot of these clouds. I don't want it to blend in too much. I want them to work together, but I need that background to be darker than the owl. I don't want them to be too similar in value, or he is just going to blend right into it. And I honestly suspect I will have to darken these up quite a bit once the owl's in. It'll be fast though at that point, because I've already got everything basically blocked in. So this is my last night of working on this one. I think I've got colored pencil all over the edge of that shirt. You can see where it's got the stain on there from every time it touches the Polychromos. It kind of picks up on the sleeve there. Now for this one, as usual, I designed it in Photoshop. And originally I was planning on doing an 11 by 14. 11 by 14 is a nice size because it's a standard size, so it's easy to buy a ready-made mat and just pop it in there, throw it in a standard size frame. Everything's very easy. But the problem was I had designed it, and the next day I knew something wasn't sitting right with me. The balance was just off. And sure enough, I threw it the rule of thirds guide over it. I have a video. If you do a search for Lacree and rule of thirds, it'll pop up. But I threw that over it and realized that was the problem. I was so far out of the rule of thirds, and I knew it was off. I knew the design was bad. So I had to extend the background and make it an 11 by 18 inch. By pulling the sky out further, that kept the owl on 1/3 of it and the other 2/3 the sky, and the balance was so much better. So this is a case when you are designing your artwork, seriously recommend learn Photoshop. Or there's a website called Pixlr, I think. I'll put a link in the video description. If I forget, somebody remind me. But with that, it really does help you to be able to design stuff and move things around and find out if that design is going to work before you spend 40 hours on a piece or however long the piece is going to take. And what was that, 11 by 14 I said I was going to do? It just didn't work with this piece. The layout wasn't right. Even if I shrunk the owl down to where he was only on 1/3 of it, the layout was it was all around not working with those dimensions. So Photoshop saved me from not finding that out until I started drawing. It's one of those tools that it is just so valuable for you to learn how to use. And if you feel overwhelmed learning how to use those to start with, everyone does. I sure did. I didn't know what I was doing to start with, and you don't have to be good at it to make this work. You're just getting an idea of whether or not a layout's going to work for you. I have other videos showing you how I use Photoshop to come up with my designs and how I change the backgrounds. I will try to remember to link those for you as well. Again, if I forget, somebody just remind me and I'll pull them up for you. I record these videos the day before I upload them, so by the time that day comes around, I always forget. So here, again, coming through with smaller sections, notice how sketchy my hand is. I'm not trying to make perfectly smooth, perfectly clean lines. I want it to be very sketchy, very messy, so that I have that natural feel of these clouds. Now I've switched to my filbert, the taklon bristled brush, the softer one, so that I can blend these out a bit softer. Really don't need that scrubby brush at this point. And scrubby brush, by the way, totally not a technical term. That is just those stiff brushes, those stiff, inexpensive brushes. I don't even know what they consider that type of hair. They're stiffer than a synthetic hog hair. Very cheap brushes all around. Like, cheap in that the bristles half the time just completely fall out, like all together in one piece. But they're so inexpensive it doesn't really matter, and there's certain techniques with painting that I love them for. They're a stiff round brush. When you buy them new, I don't think they would even work that well for this. The only reason mine worked very well is because it was so stiff, because it was damaged. The scrubber that I'm going to link, again, if I remember, somebody remind me about that if I don't too. I really should just make notes. But or that brush, the scrubber, it's a stiffer one, but it doesn't seem to absorb as much paint, and it's already as stiff as the larger one I was using earlier was. The only reason I went with that one over the smaller actual scrubber is the scrubber that I have is really tiny. I need to order a larger one. It came in my Smart Art box. I didn't even know those brushes existed, in all honesty, because I never ever see them at the art store. So it's one that I'll end up buying online. I believe they're typically used with watercolor. So you can see again here, this is super dark just because it's darkening the paper under it. When it dries, it's not going to be that dark. Again, coming back on top with some of that white pencil. One of the things that I ended up doing on areas that I really wanted poofiness is made little circles. There is the scrubber that I've been talking about. That brush is amazing for blending these clouds for the last layers. I'm not sure how well it'll work on portraits and some of the softer things. I'll probably try it out a little bit on the owl. I'll let you know how that goes. But for the clouds, it was so good because I was able to take it and pull the bottom section of the clouds. There is paint thinner on it, not very much. And I was able to pull or soften the bottom edge of the clouds. And that's really important here. I want the upper section to be pretty well defined, but that bottom section needs to soften out. And so that's really what I was doing with that brush. I was able to scrub that down. And you don't have to add a lot of pressure. If you push too hard, you could actually damage the tooth of the paper. You don't need a lot of pressure with that brush to get that look, but see how nicely it softens it to where it almost looks like pastels. And that has a rounded tip. It looks like it's flat here, but it's not. And this is the stage where you just want to keep backing up. Use your cell phone, take a photo of your work a lot, look at it that way so you can see it small and see if any areas need to be brighter or darker. This is really where you want to be looking for that sort of thing. And here, again, because I'm going to go back over once I get the owl in, I can make adjustments there. But the main thing when you're doing these clouds is just to build up that depth. You don't want flat white up against flat gray. I have so many values in here to get this look. You can see when I take that white over the dark areas, I end up with a medium shade of gray. So it's just an easy way to get these different values. But if I didn't have that gray dark enough in the first place, then that white wouldn't have given me that look. So you can see the upper section of these clouds. Again, I am doing even more definition on those and then softening out the bottom. I can't stress enough the importance of variation when you get these shapes. Do not make them all the same. Don't make them all rounded baked potatoes or the way the kids draw the loops when we're younger. Don't do any of that. There has to be variation if you want these to look natural. And you want to, like everything else I say all the time, they're abstract shapes. If you're trying to see them as clouds, it can be pretty confusing. If you're trying to copy your picture exactly, if you're new to drawing clouds and you are trying to make it pretty close to your reference photo, look at them as abstract shapes. Flip it upside down. Work the whole thing upside down in something like this would definitely make it a lot easier. Let's see again, hitting the tops and then smudging it downwards. And at this point, I've really gotten rid of most of those worms that I had in the sky. You can see I've got these thicker clumps now where I've connected them. Notice when I hit the tops of these clouds, I'm not going all the way across the top, or that's how you end up with the worms. I'm doing select areas, little spots here and there that have those highlights. Now, as I'm getting down to these darker clouds, I'm not pushing very hard with that white. I'm using the edge of it very, very light and smudging it out. Again, gives you that very pastel soft feel. And that only works if you've got a lot of pigment underneath it already. And you don't have to keep it to so few colors. In this one, there's a very good chance that I'm going to end up using some magenta in this owl because I'm using this, he's got this brownish tone or orange brown Naples yellowish color. I'm just throwing out a lot of words there, aren't I? He's going to need probably a bit of magenta in those feathers because those colors work so well together. If I end up using that magenta, I'm going to need to take that magenta and pull it into the clouds as well in a few areas just to make the two work together. So that is something that we will see next week. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, let me know.